It was a quiet afternoon in a small downtown area, the kind of place where people moved at their own pace, and nobody expected trouble. Steven Seagal walked alone across a public parking lot, dressed simply in a black jacket, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. There was nothing flashy about him, no entourage, no cameras, no signs that he was anyone special. To most people passing by, he looked like just another man running errands, minding his own business. Nearby, a police officer had just arrived after a minor disturbance was reported in the area. His mood was already tense. As his eyes scanned the crowd, they landed on Steven. Something about him triggered suspicion, maybe the way he stood calmly. Maybe the fact that he didn't look nervous like others usually did when a police car pulled up. The officer stepped toward Steven with a sharp tone. "Hey you. Stop right there." Steven turned slowly, his expression calm and neutral. "Yes, officer," he replied, his voice steady. Instead of explaining the situation, the officer immediately became aggressive. He demanded to know what Steven was doing there, why he was standing alone, and why he looked out of place. Steven answered respectfully, telling him he was just passing through and hadn't caused any trouble. But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He stepped closer, invading Steven's personal space, clearly trying to assert dominance. People nearby began to notice. A few stopped walking. Others slowed down, sensing tension in the air. Steven didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move away either. His calmness seemed to irritate the officer even more. "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped. "I'm asking the questions here." Steven simply nodded. "I understand, officer. I'm cooperating." That calm response only made things worse. The officer clenched his jaw, mistaking Steven's composure for disrespect. The situation, which could have ended in seconds, now felt dangerously close to crossing a line. A woman across the street whispered to her friend, "Why is he treating him like that?" Another man pulled out his phone, just in case. Steven stood still, grounded, his posture relaxed but unshaken. He had spent a lifetime learning discipline, control, and restraint, but the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. And then, without warning, the officer made a decision that would change everything. Because the man he was about to confront was not just anyone. The officer took another step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement as he closed the distance between himself and Steven. The space felt suddenly tight, heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. Steven could feel the tension, but his expression didn't change. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his shoulders loose, his posture calm. "Turn around," the officer ordered. "Now." Steven tilted his head slightly, not in defiance, but in confusion. "Officer," he said evenly, "may I ask what this is about?" That single question was enough to trigger the officer's temper. He interpreted it as a challenge, a refusal to submit without explanation. His voice rose, loud enough for people across the lot to hear. "I don't owe you an explanation," the officer snapped. "You do what I tell you." People nearby stopped what they were doing. A couple loading groceries into their car paused. Two teenagers leaned against a wall, eyes fixed on the scene. Someone across the street slowly lifted their phone, pressing record. Steven nodded again. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "I just want to understand." The officer scoffed. "You're acting suspicious, standing around, watching people." "I'm just passing through," Steven replied. Without warning, the officer shoved him hard in the chest. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Steven took a half step back, but he didn't stumble. He didn't react. He didn't even raise his hands. That lack of reaction only fueled the officer's anger. "You think you're tough?" the officer barked. "You think you can just stare me down?" Before anyone could process what was happening, the officer's fist came forward fast, reckless, and completely unjustified. The punch landed squarely against Steven's face. Time seemed to freeze. Several people screamed. A woman covered her mouth in shock. Phones were now fully raised, recording from multiple angles. This was no longer a private encounter, it was public, undeniable, and unfolding in real time. Steven's head turned slightly from the impact, but his feet stayed planted. He didn't fall. He didn't strike back. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened himself and faced the officer again. The officer looked almost surprised. He had expected fear, maybe pain, maybe submission. Instead, he saw calm, Steven wiped a small line of blood from his lip with the back of his hand. His eyes stayed focused, steady, controlled. There was no anger in them, only awareness. The crowd buzzed with disbelief. "Did you see that? He just punched him. Why isn't he fighting back?" One man stepped forward slightly, then hesitated, afraid to get involved. Another shook his head and muttered, "This isn't right." The officer puffed out his chest, misreading the moment entirely. To him, this was dominance, control, authority. "You going to listen now?" he said, almost smug. Steven said nothing. He simply stood there, breathing evenly, absorbing the moment. Years of training had taught him that real power wasn't about reacting, it was about restraint. Have you ever seen power abused like this before? Tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from right now? The situation had gone too far. The crowd knew it, the cameras knew it, but the officer still had no idea. He had just punched the wrong man. For a moment after the punch, no one spoke. The parking lot felt frozen in time, like the world itself was holding its breath. The officer stood there, chest rising and falling fast, adrenaline rushing through him. In his mind, he had just established control. He expected shouting, fear, maybe even a desperate apology, but Steven Seagal didn't give him any of that. Instead, Steven slowly turned his head back to center. He rolled his shoulders once, gently, as if loosening tight muscles rather than reacting to violence. His face showed no rage, no panic, only calm awareness, the kind that unsettled people far more than anger ever could. The officer frowned. That wasn't supposed to happen. What? The officer snapped. "You think this is funny?" Steven looked at him, straight into his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. "You shouldn't have done that." The words were simple, quiet, almost emotionless, yet something about them sent a ripple through the crowd. The officer let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Steven said nothing. That silence confused the officer. He stepped closer again, invading Steven's space, trying to provoke a reaction. He wanted shouting. He wanted resistance. He wanted justification for what he'd already done. But Steven remained perfectly still. Around them, the crowd had grown. Cars slowed as drivers craned their necks to see. Several people were now openly filming, their phones held steady, capturing every second. A man whispered, "Why is he so calm?" A woman shook her head. "That cop's going to regret this." The officer reached out and grabbed Steven by the jacket collar. "That punch didn't wake you up?" he snarled. Steven gently removed the officer's hand, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to create space. The movement was smooth, precise, almost effortless. It wasn't a fight move, it was a boundary. That was when the officer hesitated. For the first time since this started, doubt flickered across his face. Not fear, but uncertainty. He felt it. Something about this man wasn't normal. The balance, the stillness, the complete lack of panic. "You don't touch people like that," Steven said quietly. The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced around and noticed the phones, the witnesses, the attention. His tone shifted, not calmer, but sharper, more defensive. "You're resisting now," he said loudly, as if performing for the crowd. "I told you to comply." "I haven't resisted anything," Steven replied. "You hit me." That sentence landed heavy. The crowd reacted instantly. "He's right," someone shouted. "You can't do that." Another voice added, "This is on camera." The officer raised his voice to drown them out. Everyone stepped back. This is police business. But the moment had already slipped from his control. Steven stood there, grounded, breathing slow and steady. Inside, years of discipline held him in check. He knew exactly how much damage he could do if he chose to, but he also knew that true strength meant not needing to prove it. He took a step back himself, creating distance. "I don't want trouble," he said, "but I won't be treated like this." The officer clenched his fists, pacing slightly now. His authority felt thinner, stretched. He had crossed a line, and somewhere deep down, he knew it. The crowd murmured louder. Phones zoomed in. Someone whispered, "That guy's different." Another said, "Why hasn't he fought back?" That question hung in the air. Steven's calm wasn't weakness, it was control. And control is unsettling to those who rely on fear. The officer reached toward his cuffs, not fully committing, just enough for everyone to notice. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Steven didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He simply waited. And that was the moment the crowd truly realized something was off. If someone punched you in public like this, would you keep control? Or would you react? Be honest, tell us in the comments. The officer looked around again. Too many witnesses, too many cameras, too much attention. He leaned in and lowered his voice. "You think you're special?" he muttered. "You think this ends well for you?" Steven met his gaze, unwavering. "This already isn't ending well," he said calmly. "Just not for the reasons you think." Those words struck harder than the punch. The officer stepped back, unsettled now, his confidence cracking. He didn't know it yet, but the situation was already shifting against him. The balance of power was changing, and everyone watching could feel it. Somewhere in the crowd, a man narrowed his eyes, staring closely at Steven's face. "Wait a second," he whispered. "I've seen him before." The truth was about to surface, and when it did, everything would change. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. The officer stood a few steps away now, no longer advancing, no longer shouting. His posture had changed, less aggressive, more guarded. He kept glancing around, aware that the crowd had grown and that dozens of phones were pointed directly at him. Steven remained exactly where he was, calm, still, unshaken. Then a voice broke through the low murmur of the crowd. "Wait, doesn't he look familiar?" It came from a man standing near the edge of the parking lot, his phone halfway raised, his eyes narrowed as he studied Steven's face. At first, no one responded, but the man didn't drop it. He stepped closer, squinting, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "I swear I've seen him before," he said again. The woman next to him leaned in, taking a closer look. "From where?" she asked. "I don't know," the man replied slowly. "Movies, maybe." That single word "movies" sparked something. A few more people in the crowd began to look at Steven differently now. Not just as a random man being harassed, but as someone who might actually be recognizable. A teenager whispered to his friend, "Bro, that kinda looks like Steven Seagal." His friend laughed at first. "No way. Why would he be here?" But once the idea was spoken out loud, it refused to go away. More heads turned, more eyes focused on Steven's face. The jawline, the calm stare, the unmistakable presence. Someone pulled up a photo on their phone, comparing it discreetly. "Hold on," a woman murmured. "That is him, isn't it?" Whispers spread quickly now, moving like a wave through the crowd. "That's Steven Seagal, the action movie guy? The martial arts legend? No way. Really?" The officer heard the murmurs but didn't understand them. He glanced around, irritated. "What are you all whispering about?" he snapped. No one answered him directly. Steven noticed the shift, but he didn't react. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't confirm or deny. He simply stood there, eyes forward, as if none of it mattered to him. That humility only made the moment heavier. A man near the front spoke a little louder this time. "Officer, you might want to check who that is," the officer scoffed. "I don't care who he thinks he is," he replied. "Nobody gets special treatment." "That's not what he meant," someone else said quietly. The tension changed shape. It wasn't just about abuse of power anymore. It was about ignorance, about pride, about an officer who had already gone too far without knowing who he was dealing with. Steven finally spoke again, his tone calm and even. "This doesn't need to be about names," he said. "It should be about respect." Those words only fueled the crowd's reaction. "He's right. That punch was out of line. You can't do that, officer." The officer's face flushed. He felt the control slipping through his fingers. He had relied on intimidation. But intimidation doesn't work when an audience stops being afraid. The whispers grew louder. "That's definitely him. I watched his movies growing up. He's famous and he's not even using it." The officer stared at Steven, searching his face for cracks, fear, arrogance, anything. But there was nothing. Just calm confidence. He suddenly felt exposed. Somewhere in the back, a man laughed nervously. "Man, if that really is Steven Seagal, this is bad." Steven shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed. He wasn't enjoying this. Fame had nothing to do with why he stood his ground. He hadn't stayed calm because he was famous, he had stayed calm because that's who he was. The officer took a step back, then stopped himself, as if realizing that retreat would look like weakness. He straightened his shoulders instead. "I'm not done here," he said sharply. The crowd didn't believe him anymore. Phones were everywhere now, live streams, recordings, comments popping up in real time. The officer had become the focus of the scene, not Steven. A woman near the front whispered, almost in awe. He could have destroyed him, and he chose not to. That was when the realization truly settled in. This man wasn't just calm, he was dangerous in the most controlled way possible. And the officer, whether he liked it or not, was starting to understand that he had made a very serious mistake, because the truth was no longer a secret. It was spreading through the crowd, second by second, and once it reached the right ears, there would be no turning back. The officer stood there, chest heaving, jaw tight, hands twitching at his sides. Every instinct in his body screamed for control, dominance, and submission from the man he had just struck. But that control, the very thing he relied on to assert his authority, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The more he tried to intimidate Steven Seagal, the more the crowd's attention shifted away from him. Phones were raised, eyes were fixed, whispers were rising like wildfire. The officer's authority was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Steven, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, calm, grounded, unshaken. His eyes, sharp and steady, never left the officer's face. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't step forward. He didn't shout. Every movement he made, small, precise, controlled, radiated a silent power, far more compelling than any scream or threat could. He was in full command of himself, and the difference between his calm and the officer's rising panic was palpable. Finally, Steven spoke. His voice was low but firm, carrying easily across the crowd. "Officer," he said evenly, "violence is not authority. Intimidation is not respect. You don't gain control by hitting someone." The words struck deep. They weren't angry. They weren't defensive. They were truth delivered with unwavering clarity. The crowd immediately quieted, sensing the weight in what he said. All at once, the attention shifted fully onto the confrontation itself, the punch, the officer, and Steven's calm response. "Respect," Steven continued, "is not about fear. It's not about power. It's about understanding boundaries, dignity, and humanity. You crossed a line, one that should never exist, between someone simply living their life and those entrusted to protect them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People whispered to one another, "He's right. This guy's calm, but he's not someone to mess with. He's not even using force. And yet, he owns the situation." The officer's face turned red, then pale, then flushed again. Every word from Steven chipped away at the sense of control he thought he had. He stammered, searching for an argument, for a justification, for anything that could restore his authority, but there was none. He was outmatched, not by violence, but by presence, composure, and the undeniable truth in Steven's words. You don't understand," the officer muttered, his voice cracking. Steven shook his head slightly. "I do understand. I understand the mistake you made. But understanding doesn't excuse it, and excuses won't protect you from accountability." The crowd reacted audibly. A man in the front muttered, "He's schooling him," without even raising his voice. A woman nodded, holding her phone, recording everything. "This is going viral," she said to her friend. "Look at how calm he is." The officer glanced around, noticing dozens of faces staring at him, phones aimed directly at him. The whispers were growing louder. Some in the crowd had started shouting words of support for Steven. "He's right. Stop this. Back off. You can't do that." The officer's mind raced. He had imagined authority as a tool, a weapon. But he hadn't counted on the weight of witness, the weight of truth, or the weight of someone who refused to fight on his terms. He clenched his fists, then unclenched. He took a deep breath, and yet he couldn't regain the balance he had lost. Steven, on the other hand, took a single step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just a simple movement that shifted the dynamic further in his favor. His presence dominated the space without any outward display of force. "Look around you," Steven said softly, letting the words carry. "Every person here has seen what just happened. Every person knows what is right. Every person knows who is in the wrong." The statement landed hard. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of realization moving through them. The officer had not only acted violently, but had acted without reason. And now he was exposed. Someone from the crowd leaned closer to a friend and whispered, "Do you see how he's handling this? The calmness, the confidence. It's like he's untouchable." Another added, "That punch was supposed to make him submit, and instead, Look at him. He's still in control." Steven didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply stood in measured silence, letting the truth speak for itself. The officer's power, built on intimidation, crumbled under the weight of integrity, composure, and undeniable authority. Finally, the officer muttered something under his breath, a barely audible, I didn't expect this." His eyes darted to the crowd, to the phones, to Steven, and fear flickered across his expression. For the first time, he realized he had underestimated the man he had struck. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing the shift. Witnesses exchanged glances, recording every moment. The balance of the encounter had changed entirely. Steven's presence, his words, and his calm demeanor had turned the tables without a single act of aggression beyond his initial restraint. In a public space filled with eyes and cameras, he had shown the crowd and the officer what true control and respect looked like. The officer took a small step back. He wasn't surrendering verbally yet, but inside, he knew the fight was lost. Not physically, not in terms of confrontation, but morally and publicly, he had lost. And the longer he lingered, the more evident it became. Steven remained still, waiting for the next move, his calm radiating outward like a wave of inevitability. The truth had begun to surface, and everyone around, every witness, every bystander, could feel it. By now, the crowd was buzzing with tension, curiosity, and disbelief. Phones were raised in every direction, live streaming the confrontation in real time. People whispered, nudged their neighbors, and exchanged incredulous glances. Something was changing. The dynamic between Steven Seagal and the officer had shifted. The officer was no longer the unquestioned authority in the space he was exposed, frustrated, and visibly unsettled. Every onlooker could sense it. Just as the officer seemed to regain a fragment of composure, a new presence entered the scene. A uniformed senior officer arrived, moving quickly but purposefully through the crowd. The moment he saw Steven, his eyes widened, and he froze. There was instant recognition. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the tension. "Sir?" "That's Steven Seagal," the officer said, almost whispering, though the words carried clearly across the space. The reaction was immediate. The crowd turned to look, their whispers now escalating into murmurs of shock and excitement. "Wait, seriously? Is that really him? No way. Steven Seagal?" The original officer, the one who had thrown the punch, stiffened. His face drained of color, shifting from flushed red to pale, and then a deep shade of embarrassment. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously as he processed the revelation. Every muscle in his body betrayed him, his pride, his misplaced confidence, his aggression all collapsing under the realization of who he had just confronted. The senior officer stepped closer, subtly positioning himself between Steven and the aggressor. "Sir," he said gently but firmly, "you need to calm down. This situation is already escalating. Let's handle this properly." The crowd grew louder, murmurs now rising into audible conversations. People were talking to one another in disbelief. "He could have easily crushed him," one man exclaimed. "Did you see that?" And he didn't even fight back. Steven remained composed. Not a flicker of pride or ego crossed his face. His calm demeanor was magnetic. It drew the attention of every bystander and seemed to radiate control over the situation. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, and didn't display aggression. Instead, he exuded quiet authority, the kind that commands respect naturally, without demanding it. The first officer, still standing nearby, could barely meet anyone's eyes. He shifted his weight, nervously looking at the senior officer, at the growing crowd, and back at Steven. I didn't realize," he stammered, but no one let him finish. Steven's voice, calm yet unwavering, cut through the chaos. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about respect. It's about understanding that violence doesn't give you authority, and it's about the fact that everyone here deserves to be treated fairly." His words hit the crowd like a wave. There was a collective understanding, a ripple of realization that this moment was about far more than a punch or a public confrontation. It was about integrity, control, and humility. People began to cheer quietly, then louder, expressing admiration not for a celebrity, but for a man who stood firm under pressure, who refused to respond with violence despite being attacked. The officer's embarrassment deepened. He attempted to offer a weak apology. I'm sorry, he muttered, almost inaudibly, clearly ashamed of what he had done. The senior officer guided him gently back, signaling him to step aside. The officer's fists unclenched, his posture slumped. He knew he had lost. Not physically, not legally yet, but morally, publicly, and undeniably. The crowd now focused entirely on Steven. Cameras captured every expression, every calm breath, every measured glance. Children who had been watching quietly clutched their parents' hands. Adults nodded in respect, many shaking their heads in disbelief at the level of composure Steven maintained. One bystander whispered, clearly in awe, "He didn't even need to fight back. And now the officer is humiliated. That's insane." Another added, "He's teaching everyone a lesson without saying much at all. Incredible." Steven finally spoke again, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the crowd. "No one should be judged by appearance," he said. "No one deserves to be attacked without cause, and no act of aggression should ever be met with more aggression. We can choose respect instead. That's the only way to truly protect ourselves and each other." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply. The crowd erupted into applause, not for a celebrity, but for a man who demonstrated courage, discipline, and moral strength under extreme pressure. The first officer, still pale and shaken, finally nodded slightly, acknowledging his wrongdoing. He muttered an apology directly to Steven, who gave him a simple nod in return. No gloating, no smugness, just calm, measured acknowledgement. If you were in Steven's place, would you forgive this officer? Type yes if you believe in forgiveness, or no if you think he should face consequences. In that moment, the crowd understood something profound. Real power does not come from violence. Real authority comes from restraint, composure, and moral courage. And everyone who witnessed this encounter, from the casual bystander to those streaming live, would remember the lesson for a long time. Steven remained standing, quiet, but commanding. The truth had been revealed, and the world was. The video of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of people had seen it online, and the numbers were climbing fast. Clips from multiple angles circulated on social media, showing every detail: the punch, Steven Seagal's calm demeanor, the officer's growing panic, and the moment the truth about Steven's identity was revealed. The story was no longer just a local incident. It had become a global phenomenon. News outlets picked it up quickly. Headlines ranged from the dramatic, "Officer punches, wrong man, martial arts, legend stands unshaken," to the analytical, "Public power versus authority, lessons from a Steven Seagal encounter." People across countries were discussing it. Fans of action films, social justice advocates, martial arts enthusiasts, and ordinary citizens alike. Everyone was captivated by the extraordinary calm and self-control Steven had displayed in the face of aggression. On social media, the comments were pouring in. People were praising Steven's restraint. Some wrote, "He could have crushed him in seconds, yet he stayed calm. That's real strength." Others shared personal reflections, like, "I wish I had that level of self-control in my life." The hashtag number respect not fear began trending, and millions engaged in discussions about the importance of dignity, self-restraint, and standing up for oneself without resorting to violence. Meanwhile, the officer faced immediate scrutiny. His department initiated an internal investigation to determine the circumstances that led to his aggressive behavior. Legal experts discussed the implications of using excessive force, especially against someone who was completely cooperative. It became clear that the officer's actions were unjustified and that he had severely underestimated the person he confronted. Many social media users demanded accountability, calling for disciplinary measures or even suspension. The story had sparked a broader conversation about police conduct, judgment, and responsibility. Steven, on his part, handled the aftermath with the same measured composure he had displayed during the confrontation. In interviews, he emphasized the importance of humility, self-discipline, and respect. "I hold no anger," he said. "This isn't about me being a celebrity. It's about teaching a lesson on how we should treat each other, regardless of status or appearance. Violence doesn't create respect, it destroys it." His statements resonated widely. People admired him not just as a martial artist or an actor, but as a role model demonstrating the power of self-control in a tense, real-world situation. The incident became a case study in moral courage. Experts and commentators analyzed it from multiple angles. The psychological effect of calm authority over aggression, the importance of public accountability, and the ways social media amplifies lessons of human behavior. Videos of Steven's actions were being used in workshops and seminars to illustrate how discipline, presence of mind, and ethical behavior can override brute force. The public reaction also had an immediate effect on the officer. Facing scrutiny from both the public and his department, he issued a formal apology. While some remained critical, many noted that acknowledging one's mistakes was the first step toward growth. Steven, consistent with his principles, accepted the apology quietly, signaling that forgiveness and understanding are also forms of strength. Beyond the immediate consequences, the story carried a larger message. People began reflecting on how they interact with authority, strangers, and those who may be unfairly judged. Social media campaigns encouraged sharing personal experiences of restraint, courage, and standing up for justice. Steven's calm response became a blueprint for handling conflict with integrity, demonstrating that physical power is less important than moral power. Globally, the story resonated with millions. From fans in Manila to viewers in New York, London, and Tokyo, people celebrated the example Steven set. Memes, reaction videos, and commentary exploded online, all centered on the lesson that composure and dignity often speak louder than violence. Even outside the realm of entertainment and martial arts, the narrative inspired conversations about fairness, accountability, and respect in everyday life. And yet, Steven remained humble. He did not seek recognition for what he had done. He did not boast or capitalize on his celebrity. Instead, he used the moment to highlight a principle: that anyone, regardless of fame or skill, can stand for justice and dignity through calm, reasoned action. If you believe no one should be judged by appearance or power alone, type respect in the comments. Share this story with friends, and remember that true strength is shown through control, humility, and integrity. Subscribe for more inspiring stories where courage and dignity triumph over fear and aggression. The incident would be remembered not as a fight or confrontation, but as a lesson in human behavior. It was proof that composure, moral clarity, and patience can transform even the most tense situations into moments of education and inspiration. Steven Seagal had not only defended himself without violence, but he had also left a lasting impression on every person who witnessed it live, recorded, or online. And in doing so, he reminded the world that the strongest response is often the calmest one. The story spread, inspired millions, and served as a powerful reminder. Authority can command fear, but true power commands respect. And in the end, it's respect that leaves a legacy.